Order, disorder, reorder. This is the way of things. From life to scripture to sports to gardening to climate to business to forestry to chemistry to ecosystems to bodily systems to evolution to history to narratives to literature and movies and playwrights. This is the rhythm of all those things. Order always gives way to disorder, and it can stay disordered for a very long time, centuries if it must, until it's acted upon. And that's what I need you to see today. Order gives way to disorder. And disorder can linger. And it can just sit that way until acted upon, until something new enters the fray. The same is true for our faith. When left to our own devices, we fail, we weaken, we fall, and we become disordered. It's just the way of things. I mean, how many diets have you started and failed? How many times have you attempted to read a devotion every single morning of your life, only to make it 3 straight mornings and then things unravel? Order gives way to disorder, but it can stay that way for a while. And that's what we're exploring in Scripture and in this sermon series. This process I'm talking about is known as a canonical study of Scripture. You study the canon as a whole. Imagine getting up on the balcony and looking down at the dance floor. That's what canonical scholars do. They pay attention to the entirety of the Bible, the meta-narrative, and they see things that others don't. And they make note of the movements and the trends. At times, it is very, very helpful to hold the Bible at 30,000 feet, because what you see is a mass movement of order, disorder, reorder. Genesis to Deuteronomy is about setting up the order of how life works. Nomadic groups from communities which form civilizations then form laws on how life ought to be governed. Then they form judges and then kings, and then kings govern the laws that they created. Communities order themselves around central, universal themes and totems. And honestly, that's not different today at all. And we see this most clearly when we study the story of Exodus, especially around the 10 Commandments. And for those who may not know this story, Israel was enslaved by the Egyptians. Moses and Aaron, through heroic and honestly out of this world happenings, rescue God's people and lead them to Mount Sinai, where more out of this world happenings unfold. The entire book of Exodus is worth its own read sometime. But right now, what I want you to hear are these words from Exodus 19, 1 through 6. It's when the Israelites make it to Mount Sinai. Moses rescues them and brings them to Mount Sinai, where God is to order their lives around the 10 Commandments. When they arrive at the mountain, we read this. On the 3rd moon, after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They had journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice, keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." It's right here things start to order. God enacts rules for Israel to follow. And honestly, it's beautifully ordered. I mean, right after this, in Exodus 20, that's where we get the 10 Commandments. 5 for how we build relationships with God, and then 5 for how we're to relate to one another. Now, we've heard these 10 commandments and orders before. You love God the most, no false idols, don't profane the Lord's name, keep the Sabbath, don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery, love those who parent you, and don't lie. But you must not know, but you may not know, that Moses was up on the mountain for a very long time, and God gave him many more rules to enact too. For instance, Exodus 21 is what the law should be about for property rights and value. But then Exodus 22 is a chapter on the laws of restitution. If someone steals your oxen, what are you owed? In Exodus 23, it's about annual festivals and sabbaticals that you're supposed to keep, and especially around years and your crops. Exodus 24 and 30 is about how sacred things will look. Now, trust me when I say there is a ton of detail involved in the beautification of the tabernacle, which holds the Ark of the Covenant, the priestly garments, the ordinations of how the people are going to worship, or how you administer incense while you're worshiping. Lots of detail. Exodus is chapter after chapter after chapter of how God's people are to order themselves. And all of this came from God to Moses at Sinai. But it doesn't last. Honestly, it barely even begins. Order gives way to disorder. And you need this part of the story too. So Moses goes up to Sinai and speaks to God. God writes 10 universal truths and commands onto tablets for which life will be governed. But what's happening simultaneously down off the mountain on the ground is that all of Israel is falling into disorder. And you may know this moment as the golden calf story. So listen to Exodus 32. This is what's happening off the mountain. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us. Who shall go before us? As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. Now jump to verse 15. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain, carrying the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hands. Tablets that were written on both sides, written on the front and the back. Verse 19. As soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot. He threw the tablets from his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made, burned it with fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. Let me tell you what you just heard. Moses was up on the mountain getting orders from God on how to live. Down off the mountain, humanity was left to their own devices. And they disordered everything. And they did it so fast. Which tells me something about humanity that is still true today. We need something outside of us, acting upon us, inserted into the disorder to correct us. We need reordering. For Israel, this was to be the law of Moses and the priestly class. That thing for us today, ultimately, is Jesus. He is our great reorderer. And to some extent, we, the church, should be too. We, as the church, are that thing that reaches out into the lives of people as that something new, that thing that can hold the disorder, help name people's disorder, and not create a path backwards, but rather to give a path out of the enslavement of sin and help reorder people into new life. Now, there is so many examples of this, and we're going to keep exploring them, but I just want to leave you with this. Disorder is the inevitable breaking of what was. Creation gives way to sin. 10 Commandments gives way to idol worship. Time and pressure and stress and weather, it all plays a part. Disorder always follows order. It's inevitable. It's not wrong. It's inevitable. The 10 Commandments is a wonderful attempt at order, but disorder for Israel was inevitable. And reorder is going to require a conscious act. Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai becomes unconscious to their disorder, and they needed Moses to step in and correct them. Well, the same is still true for us. Moses goes on to partner with God to help reorder Israel's lives. And it works, at least until he dies, which then Israel unconsciously falls into disorder again. And what we'll see next week is that the downward spiral of what unconscious behavior and unconscious systems can do to a community. Here's a spoiler alert. Next week's sermon, it's hard. It's a sad one. It takes centuries for Israel to figure out how to reorder, only to fall prey once again to exile and another great disordering. And the story just constantly repeats itself, which tells us order, disorder, reorder. It's the order of everything, and it's still happening today. So start asking yourself, how were you ordered? And what caused your disordering? How about your faith? And what are you consciously doing to reorder it?